isn't it been an untold secret that not all multinationals, but many other multinationals have been doing similar things? So how can international businesses accurately do their due diligence and assess their risk based on a current work environment that could be completely different within a couple of weeks or a month?
Yeah. So again, it's the speed of change. And one of the things I did during the research is to track a number of cases. The GSK one, Caterpillar lost a lot of money on one of their investments in China. There have been a number of arrests around research and investigation companies dealing with personal data. And in each of these cases, I've been able to track over a number of years the small steps that have been taken to get to the point where we are now, where suddenly these arrests are happening. And there's a bit of context which is really important to understand. So you take the GSK case as an example. You end up with the arrest of a British person in China who was the general manager, which surprised a lot of people. But you go back to around 2008, where you have the fiscal stimulus for the healthcare industry coming out in China. You have a lot of focus on expansion of healthcare, how to control healthcare costs while you're building more hospitals, increasing the national healthcare insurance out to 95+% of people. So you have a lot of policy focus and a lot of spending going into the healthcare sector. For the last 30 years, everyone has known that the healthcare sector in China is corrupt. International companies have known it, local companies have known it, the government has known it. But that's just how the system worked, because hospitals make their money out of selling drugs. So there's a conflict of interest inherent in the business, and the doctors are paid very little. So the patients have been paying the doctors to get the right treatment, the drugs companies have been paying the hospitals to buy their drugs, and the hospitals have been making money out of it. All of this is kind of well known to people in the industry. But over time, the policy focus has changed. And so as well as trying to deal with the aging population and the rising cost of healthcare, China's been trying to develop indigenous innovation, trying to build up national champions in strategic industries, healthcare being one of them. So that's another strand of risk, is that you have the increase of domestic competition. Then you come in with Xi Jinping and his new government with their very big anti-corruption campaign. And that brings a third part into play. When you bring all of those together, you can see that you have a very volatile risk situation. And what we see happening with GSK, which is the example from the pharmaceutical industry, but there are other examples, is that they have managed to be the tall tree that attracts the wind, or in a sort of kung fu analogy, the chicken to scare the monkeys. You cut the throat of the chicken and scare off the monkeys. So you've got a government that's trying to end corruption in the industry. You've got a government that wants the domestic industry to grow stronger and more competitive in relation to the international firms. You have a very big, strong international firm that's done something, well, that is accused of having done something wrong. So why don't we use the stick on that big, strong foreign company to show the rest of the industry that we mean business?
So it would seem like with this shift in policy that's being initiated by the Chinese government, it would seem that the first port of call when doing due diligence is to look there, as opposed to where most Western companies first look at the business environment and then look at what the policy is. Do you think businesses should be looking at policy first?
Yeah, I think you read your business plan and then you read the 5-year plan, and you see whether your business plan is in alignment with the big picture government policy. If it's not, you are going to cut across the policy direction and you'll just be crushed. I mean, you cannot successfully run your business in China if it's not going to be aligned, at least to some extent, with the direction of macro policy development.
And that's quite different to how business operates in, say, the US and Europe, where it is this open free market where you essentially do what you want as long as you work within the confines of the law. With China, which is still a free market economy, has
with Chinese characteristics,
and this policy drive and policy direction from the government plays a much more important role that a lot of companies can reduce their risk
course
if they
we-
just
we-
bother reading it.
Well, exactly. We also say, read the Chinese newspapers, because you will get key messages coming out in the official media that you have to pay attention to. If the official media is saying this is going to be a focus, you want to pay attention to that. So just recently we've had the Americans accusing a number of people related to the PLA in China of hacking American companies. And the Chinese response has included a view that some of the American consulting companies operating in China maybe have too much access to confidential state secrets in state-owned enterprises, that maybe some of the American technology companies are too embedded in some of the Chinese sensitive interests. And you can see that there is a real risk that these companies might not have taken seriously enough. When you start to see these steps moving towards the risk event, and suddenly it appears in the front page of the papers that state-owned enterprises have been told not to work with the big American consulting companies, that state-owned companies and government agencies have been told not to use Windows 8 as an operating system, for example. So these are very real risks that have a business impact in one of the biggest markets in the world.
And it's a unique facet in China as well, because it's like it would be completely unheard of 10 Downing Street all of a sudden coming out and saying to people, saying to businesses not to use iOS systems. It would seem almost like overstepping, but it's perfectly acceptable in China.
Well, you have this link with the state and state-owned enterprises, and that's something that people have to be very aware of in a risk context. And also it touches on compliance, because you might find that the executives in a state-owned enterprises are considered to be government officials, and that brings you into a whole new area of compliance risk. So, but to go back to your original question, yes, I think you need to start with political and regulatory due diligence. In the book, I look at a number of different types of due diligence, including starting with political and regulatory, and then moving into things like commercial due diligence, operational due diligence, legal, financial, and other sorts of due diligence. But you start with the political and regulatory.
Okay, so we saw this much like for international businesses who are wanting to go into China, their first port of call needs to be looking at policy and making sure that their business strategy aligns with China's domestic policy. And then on an operational level, they need to be looking at sorts of soft culture cues and how that can play a role in either increasing or reducing risk. Now, what about for international businesses that aren't looking to enter into China but are just simply looking to do business with China? I mean, the one topic that is of big interest here in Europe, particularly in the UK, are now Chinese investors who are entering the UK market, setting up operations in the UK or investing in UK businesses. What are some of the risk factors that local domestic firms, who are probably even less familiar with how business runs in China, need to be made aware of? I mean, like recently we've had stories of, House of Fraser now has been sold to a Chinese company which 2 months ago most people in the business community never even heard of.
Yeah, Weetabix on my breakfast table, another one. So I think we talked earlier about the scale of China and its importance as a market. And there is a view that I kind of subscribe to, that whether or not you are doing business with China or planning to do business with China, in China or to China or from China, whether you're selling to, sourcing from, investing in, you cannot ignore the fact that China has an impact on your business. I've worked with a number of companies recently who are not in China but are starting to think about China. One of the first things we do is to do a kind of quick review of things like intellectual property. And you can go online, you can use the Chinese government websites, go online, check your trademark status in China. And again and again and again, these companies are surprised to find that maybe half a dozen people have already registered their trademark under different classifications in China, which is a first to file jurisdiction. So whether or not you currently want to do business in China, you probably will find yourself somehow involved with China at some point, or you will find that even though you're not doing anything in China, somebody is doing your business with your trademark in China and you can't do anything about it.
reminds me of the problem that Starbucks faced with China. Starbucks had set up in China with